Welcome to Wife Cheating Story. I hope you have an enjoyable and relaxing time listening. Let's get started.
I never thought of myself as unforgettable. Not once. I've always known exactly the kind of man I am. Quiet, consistent, someone who keeps his promises. I've spent most of my life in the Pacific Northwest, and frankly, that's how I like it. My business is roofing and structural engineering. Nothing flashy, but reliable. My company's kept hundreds of homes standing through storms, tremors, and time. I built something steady, and for a long time, I thought that kind of steadiness meant something. To me, it always has. I'm 54. I drive a black 19 Tacoma that still smells faintly like sawdust and pine. My home's something I designed myself. Nothing over the top, just clean lines, warm wood, and large windows that watch the rain roll in like old friends. I don't throw parties. I don't collect watches. I read technical manuals like novels and find peace in sharpening my tools on a Sunday morning with coffee in hand. I thought maybe, just maybe, that kind of man was enough. Then there was her. Tessa Langford came into my life almost 3 years ago, and from the beginning, she felt like a gust of wind sweeping through a still room. She was 46, twice divorced, with a talent for commanding attention in any setting. Regional sales director for a biotech firm. The kind of woman who walked into a restaurant and had 5 heads turned before she even sat down. Where I paused, she pressed forward. Where I considered, she reacted. I'll admit, I found it refreshing at first. Like pairing steel with flame. We didn't live together, not officially, but she was at my place most weekends. Sometimes Thursdays too. She had her own toothbrush in my bathroom, her heels lined up next to my work boots, a few scarves hanging from the hooks by the front door. I even cleared out a full dresser drawer for her, which for a man like me, was practically a wedding vow. Our routines were simple. Saturday morning walks, evenings with jazz or crime documentaries. She liked wine. I preferred whiskey. She loved making last-minute reservations. I loved cooking with the pantry I'd already stocked. We clashed in the ways opposites do, but I chalked that up to chemistry. And maybe foolishly, I thought our differences would find a rhythm. They never really did, but I kept showing up, quietly hopeful. She never told me I wasn't enough. Not in words. She complimented the house, occasionally praised the work ethic, sometimes called me safe, which, back then, I took as a compliment. I thought we were building something slowly, like layering shingles one by one. I thought wrong. Now, I can't point to one moment that made everything unravel. It wasn't sudden. It never is. It was little things, comments too sharp, glances that lingered on her phone, trips she insisted were corporate that never quite lined up with the calendar. But still, I didn't push. That's not who I am. I don't chase ghosts or demand answers unless I already know what they'll be. That weekend, the one that changed everything, was quiet by all outward measures. She arrived Friday evening with a new bottle of Pinot Noir, said work had been exhausting, kissed me absent-mindedly at the door. We ate takeout on the back porch while she scrolled through messages. I asked how her team was doing. She said they were overwhelmed. I didn't press. She poured another glass, told me she needed the guest room for a video call Tuesday night with her friends. I nodded and went back to my drafting table. Tuesday came, and with it, the shift I didn't see coming. She had always been open about her vintage circle, a nickname her group of longtime friends had proudly embraced. 5 women, Mira, Kelsey, Joanna, B, and Samira, all in their 40s and early 50s. All fierce, all opinionated, all somewhat obsessed with red wine and shared trauma. They joked about ex-husbands, investments gone wrong, therapy breakthroughs. I'd heard plenty of those conversations drifting through the house when they were on speaker. Some nights, I even chuckled from the next room. They weren't my circle, but I respected their bond. This time, I wasn't eavesdropping. I'd gone upstairs to retrieve an old blueprint stored on my iPad. I needed it for a roofing reinforcement project scheduled later in the month. The iPad was in the hallway cabinet, right outside the guest room. Her voice filtered through the cracked door. She didn't know I was standing there. I wasn't trying to listen. Then I heard it. "Graham?" "Oh, please," she said, her tone heavy with amusement. "He's not ugly. He's just forgettable." The room erupted in laughter. If I left, she added, he'd probably write me a poem instead of getting angry. More laughter. One of the women, Kelsey, maybe snorted. Another one said, "God, he sounds like my first husband." A voice I didn't recognize joked, "Well, hey, at least he's handy." Tessa chimed in again, her words slower this time, almost calculating. He's got a decent portfolio. That's about it. That was the moment I knew the foundation had cracked. Not because of the words themselves, but the ease with which she delivered them. Like I was a placeholder. Like I was furniture she tolerated for comfort. It wasn't rage that hit me, it was clarity. I stood there a little longer than I should have. Not because I was shocked, but because I was stunned at how unsurprised I felt. Like some quiet part of me had already known. That little voice inside, the one we all ignore, had been whispering for months. I just hadn't listened. I turned, walked downstairs, sat in the kitchen, and stared at the notepad we keep by the wine rack. Normally it's for grocery lists or reminders, but that night it served another purpose. I picked up a pen, tore off a single sheet, and wrote just 7 words. You're easy to forget too. I placed the note beside her wine glass on the counter, exactly where she'd see it. Then I took her suitcase from the bedroom closet, the one she used for conferences and girls' trips, and set it by the front door. I didn't yell. I didn't wait for her to notice. I didn't give her a chance to spin the words or drown me in laughter again. I just grabbed my truck keys, opened the door, and walked out. No noise. No storm. Just silence. The kind that comes after a house loses power. And for the first time in a long time, that silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Tuesday night never looked suspicious on the surface. The house was still, the porch light hummed, and the faint sound of rain tapped against the window panes. Tessa had mentioned earlier in the week that her wine circle, what she proudly called the vintage circle, had a virtual catch-up scheduled. It wasn't unusual. I'd heard their voices drift through the guest room door before, usually mingled with laughter, half-shouted complaints about men, age, diets, bosses. I never minded. It was background noise to my drafting work, like wind through trees, something constant, familiar, harmless. I was in the hallway when it happened. Not to spy. Not to linger. I'd forgotten my iPad charger in the hallway cabinet near the guest room, and I needed it for some rooftop pitch models I was working on. I walked barefoot so the old hardwood wouldn't creak. I wasn't trying to listen, but I heard my name. You can tell a lot by the way your name is said behind a closed door. There's a tone that sits between mockery and dismissal. When I heard it, my hand paused just above the cabinet drawer. And then I heard her voice, clearly, speaking louder than usual. Graham, she said, her tone laced with amusement, like someone setting up a joke. Oh, please. He's not ugly. He's just forgettable. I stood there, unmoving. My hand never touched the charger. Her words hung in the air like damp fog. If I left, she continued, he'd probably write me a poem instead of getting angry. They all roared. Not polite laughter. Not a giggle. They laughed from their throats. Deep, theatrical laughter that made me picture their faces, the wine-gloss smirks, tilted heads, the kind of laughter people use to signal they're above the person being discussed. Someone added, a poem? Like a breakup sonnet. Another said, that's adorable. At least he's sweet. Tessa laughed again, louder this time. He's handy. He's got a decent portfolio. That's about it. Just background noise you can set your wine glass on. I don't remember how long I stood there. Long enough to realize this wasn't a one-time slip of the tongue. This was how she talked about me when I wasn't in the room. Not a moment of weakness, not a slip of wine-drunk cruelty. This was the version of me she handed to her friends. I didn't barge in. I didn't knock or speak. I didn't even finish reaching for the charger. I walked back down the hall with a calmness that didn't belong to me yet. I was watching myself move, like I'd stepped outside my body. I reached the kitchen, pulled out a notepad, and scribbled the 7 words that had already formed in my mind like scaffolding. You're easy to forget too. I wrote it slowly, not out of drama, but because the words were heavy, deliberate. Each letter settled into the paper like a weight being dropped gently, one by one. Then I did something I hadn't planned. I went upstairs, opened the closet where her travel bag usually sat, and pulled it down. It still had the baggage tag from her last conference. Cancun, I remembered. The one she said had been moved from Dallas last minute. I placed it near the front door without a word. She was still laughing upstairs, still talking. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew what wouldn't, pretending. By the time I stepped out into the garage, the quiet of the night felt sharper. The air was cold against my skin, but I welcomed it. I got in the truck, started the engine, and drove. Not away in panic. Not in some dramatic, tire-spinning exit. Just away. There's a place about 20 minutes outside of town. A roadside diner I hadn't been to in years. It's where I signed my first real contract back in 2003, sitting across from a local real estate developer who needed 10 townhomes roofed in under 6 weeks. That booth, second from the window, still sits where it always has. I didn't expect anyone to remember me, and no one did. That was fine. I wasn't there to be remembered. I sat down, ordered black coffee, and stared out the window. The waitress asked if I wanted cream or sugar. I said no. I drank the first few sips while the warmth crawled down into my chest like something alive. That silence in my head grew louder, not uncomfortable, just more present. Like I could hear myself thinking clearly for the first time in weeks. I pulled out my phone. I hadn't looked at it since leaving the house. Just habit, I guess. And there it was. The first ping. Then another. Then dozens in rapid succession. Calls. Messages. Missed FaceTimes. One after another, like a machine had gone haywire. It didn't stop. My screen froze for a second trying to process the flood. I let it sit on the table face up, blinking with each new notification. I counted in my head. 10, 20, 40. It passed 100 before I even touched it again. By the time the count stopped, the screen read 162 missed calls. I didn't listen to the voicemails. I didn't read a single message. I just watched them stack. That many attempts can only mean one thing, not remorse. Panic. She wasn't sorry she said it, she was sorry I heard it. I paid my bill in cash, left a quiet tip, and walked back to the truck with the air brushing my jacket. I drove further this time, toward the hills where the air thins and the pine trees get tall enough to hush your thoughts. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. No calls. No texts. Just the dark stretch of road ahead of me, clean and open. When I stopped again, it was outside my cabin near Gray Rock Ridge. 3 rooms, no Wi-Fi, spotty reception. I hadn't stayed there in almost a year. She hated it. No signal, no espresso, no style, she'd once said while dragging her heels through the dirt trail. That cabin was my reset button, my ghost town when the world got too loud. That night, it became something else. A border. As I unpacked the truck, I finally opened the phone again. Not to read anything, just to take one step. I forwarded every account and keycard Tessa had access to: financial, security, utilities, to my lawyer, Rena. I didn't add drama. I just included one line. Please remove her access effective immediately. Then I texted Joel, my assistant. I told him to shift my meetings for the next 3 days. No reason. He replied with a thumbs up and a calendar update link. I called a locksmith next. She'd return to a locked door, but by then, I'd be somewhere else entirely, in thought, in silence, in the sharp clarity of someone who finally heard what they weren't meant to hear. And what I heard was enough. I didn't leave out of anger. That's what most people don't understand. This wasn't some emotional outburst. It wasn't about proving a point or punishing her. I left because once the truth reveals itself that clearly, it becomes impossible to pretend you don't see it. That night, after reaching the cabin, I sat in front of the fireplace for over an hour, just staring at the slow crawl of flames. I didn't cry. I didn't curse. I didn't even drink. I just let the quiet sink into me like a second skin. The truth had arrived, and with it came something most people mistake for pain. But for me, it was a strange kind of peace. A quiet burn. The beginning of freedom. The following morning, I woke up with my body sore from the drive, but my mind sharper than it had been in months. Maybe longer. I made coffee the way I always did at the cabin: boiled water, French press, no sugar. I walked outside barefoot, felt the cold wood of the deck under my feet, and looked out across the forest. No traffic. No buzz of electronics. No woman tapping away at her phone with a half-smile she thought I couldn't read. By the time I stepped back inside, I'd already made up my mind. I wasn't going back to our old rhythm. Not even for closure. There was nothing left to say. She'd already said it, in front of a full audience. The worst part wasn't even the words themselves, it was the comfort with which she said them. Like I wasn't a real person. Like I was just a prop in her carefully arranged life. Something serviceable, forgettable, replaceable. Later that afternoon, I opened my iPad. She'd used it the night before to stream a documentary about bioplastics. I remembered because I had to adjust the volume for her. What she forgot, however, was to log out of her accounts. Not just one. All of them. Mail. Messages. Shared drives. I didn't go looking for anything. That's the honest truth. But when you're already standing at the edge of something broken, you don't have to look far to see the cracks. The first thing I saw was a flight receipt. Cancun. Booked during the week she claimed she had a disruptive leadership summit in Phoenix. 2 round-trip tickets. Her and someone named Cam. I didn't recognize the name, but I had a good guess. The flights matched the dates I'd dropped her at the airport. I remember the outfit, the rushed goodbye, the scent of new perfume. The next thing I found was a string of emails between her and Mira, one of the Vintage Circle regulars. At first, I thought it was harmless chatter, spa plans, meal prep kits, Instagram links, but then I read one message that stopped me. "I can't believe how quietly you choose," she wrote. "It's like eating dinner with a monk. Sometimes I want to throw a plate just to get a reaction." Mira replied, "You said he's safe. That's what you wanted, right?" Tessa responded, "I wanted a life raft, but now I'm just floating and bored." It stung more than I expected, mostly because of how petty it was. How small. I thought I was being considerate, gentle, stable. In her world, I was just a blank wall she projected herself onto. But it didn't stop there. I clicked into her drive, curiosity, I guess, mixed with disbelief, and saw a folder labeled Spring Exit Strategy. It had spreadsheets, tabs labeled Housing Options, Cam Schedule, Asset Protection, hers, Legal Soft Landings. There was even a to-do list with checkboxes. Find new apartment, Cam to finalize separation, secure bonus from Q1 close, leave letter, soft tone. I remember closing the iPad and resting it on my knee for a long time, just breathing. I didn't shake. I didn't fume. I felt relieved. Because up until then, there had still been a little part of me wondering if maybe I'd misunderstood. If maybe her words on that call were just clumsy humor. But no. That folder, that list, that receipt, they were confirmation. A roadmap of how she planned to phase me out like an old feature no longer compatible with her update. When I stood up, I didn't feel heavy. I felt still, like the weight had finally named itself. I didn't touch anything else. I didn't write back. I didn't leave a dramatic voicemail or some long-winded email she could print and mock later. I walked downstairs, opened the front closet, and took out the suitcase she hadn't used in months. The purple one with the worn zipper and the flight tag still attached. I set it by the front door of my house, our house, but only in theory. Then I went to the kitchen, where her half-finished glass of Pinot sat sweating on the marble counter, and I placed my handwritten note beside it. "You're easy to forget, too." That's all. It wasn't meant to be poetic. It wasn't revenge. It was a mirror. A 7-word echo of the insult she had launched so casually. Maybe I knew she'd never understand the simplicity of it. That wasn't the point. The point was, I wasn't going to argue for my place in someone's life ever again. I left the house without even taking an overnight bag. Just my wallet, my keys, and a spare jacket in the truck. I wasn't running. I wasn't hiding. I just needed space wide enough to contain my own breath. While I was gone, she must have realized what I'd seen. Maybe she checked her iPad and noticed she was still logged in. Maybe she read the note and felt the absence. Maybe she panicked when her key didn't turn the lock anymore. All I know is this. When I checked my phone a few hours later, it was vibrating itself off the diner table. Calls, messages, notifications in a blur. The kind of desperate flood that tells you everything you need to know. She hadn't expected me to walk away. She'd counted on my silence, my patience, my habit of staying. That was her mistake. She thought forgettable meant forgiving. I drove back to the cabin with no music, no GPS, just the rhythm of my thoughts and the hum of rubber on asphalt. It was the quietest ride of my life, and I've never felt more certain of who I am. I had barely been gone 15 minutes before the first call came through. Her name lit up on my screen like a flare, pulsing in my palm as I sat at the diner booth sipping black coffee. I didn't answer, not because I wanted to punish her, but because I had nothing left to say. She'd said enough for both of us. I turned the phone face down, let it vibrate once more, and focused on the heat of the mug between my hands. The warmth felt real, solid. Unlike the past 3 years of that hollow smile she wore while I spoke. 10 minutes later, the real avalanche started. It began like any storm does. Slow, subtle. A second call, then a third, then a text. 1 ping, then 5 more. My screen glowed like a warning beacon, flooding with missed calls, voicemails, iMessages. I just sat there, still in my booth, letting the screen collect them like rainwater. I wasn't counting at first. But curiosity got the better of me. So I flipped it over and watched the number climb. 12, 19, 30, 42. By the time my coffee went cold and the messages started with soft tones. "Can we talk?" And "Please, I didn't mean it," then shifted to irritation. Are you seriously ignoring me? Followed quickly by guilt-laced spins. This is how you handle conflict? By running away? I didn't reply. Not because I couldn't. Because I wouldn't. Because some silences are sacred. And hers had already filled too much space in my life. I forwarded the situation to my lawyer, Rena Durand. Rena had been handling my personal legal affairs for years, a calm, sharp woman who rarely spoke more than necessary. I sent her one message. Revoke access for Tessa Langford across all accounts. Financial, utilities, keys, cloud. Effective immediately. Her reply came 5 minutes later. Understood. Consider it done by morning. Next, I messaged my assistant Joel. Clear my schedule this week. Block calendar through Friday. I'll handle rescheduling myself. Joel didn't ask questions. Just sent a thumbs-up emoji and a note. Got it. Want me to prep the client status sheets for auto-send? Yes. Keep it simple. I trusted him. Always had. And in that moment, that trust felt like rare currency. After that, I called a locksmith, an old colleague of mine who owed me a favor. I didn't ask for anything extreme. Just a quiet lock change and an updated alarm code on my property. I knew she'd try to come back. Maybe with a forgot something excuse. Maybe with crocodile tears and a pre-written speech. I didn't want a confrontation. I just wanted the door to be locked when she got there. By the time I pulled back onto the road, her calls had shifted in tone. Now it was voicemails. Long ones. I didn't play them out loud, but the previews flashed up one by one on my lock screen. Graham, I know you saw the messages. Just let me explain. You're taking this out of. You're overreacting. You always were too sensitive to jokes. Please, don't do this. You know I need. Can we just talk? Are you seriously ghosting me after everything? What do you even want from me, Graham? A public apology? Fine. I'm sorry. There. You're really going to be the kind of man who writes notes and runs away? I deleted each one after reading the first line. Not because I was angry, but because she was still talking to the version of me she thought she knew. The version who stayed quiet. Who forgave without ever being asked. Who bent himself to fit a life that no longer had room for him. I was done being that man. That night, I drove past the city limits, up toward the higher ridge roads that led to my cabin. The sky turned darker as I climbed, the air thinner and cleaner. By the time I arrived, the only sound was the wind pushing through pine. I stepped out of the truck, stretched my arms, and stood in silence for a full minute. This wasn't a retreat. It was a return. The cabin had always been my space. Built it myself with a few friends back when we were younger and thought a weekend off-grid was the peak of freedom. No Wi-Fi, no smart locks, no streaming devices, just a wood stove, a well-insulated sleeping loft, and a deck that stared straight into the hills. She hated this place. Called it that hermit box. Said it was like stepping back in time, but not in a good way. But for me, it was a reset. It was truth. A place where the world could stop spinning just long enough for me to remember who I was without her orbit pulling me off center. I lit the fireplace, made myself a modest dinner, pan-seared trout I had packed in a cooler with some rice and steamed greens, and ate it slowly, like a man who wasn't rushing anywhere anymore. Then, just before bed, I turned my phone on once more. Just for curiosity's sake. Another 48 missed calls. Another 71 unread texts. One email that stood out with the subject line. Please talk to me. I didn't open it. Didn't need to. Instead, I pressed select all and hit delete. And just like that, her voice was gone. People think silence is weak. That walking away means you didn't care enough to fight. But sometimes, silence is the only thing loud enough to break the noise. Sometimes, it's the most powerful thing you have left. I looked out through the cabin window that night, mug in hand, fire crackling behind me. And I realized something I hadn't been able to see clearly before. She didn't really want me back. Not me. She wanted the version of me who let things go. Who nodded through insults. Who poured wine without asking questions. The man who stayed. But that man was gone. And the one who replaced him wasn't interested in revenge. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't plotting. He was just awake. Finally, the next morning, I left my phone on silent and hiked the trail behind the cabin. It winds through the trees and leads to a rocky ledge that overlooks the town below. Small, scattered rooftops, dots of cars moving like ants, far enough away to feel like another life. I sat there for a long time. Didn't think of her face. Didn't play back her voice. Just breathed. The kind of deep breath you take when the weight has shifted off your chest and settled back into the ground where it belongs. That day, I started something new. Not revenge. Renewal. The drive to the cabin had felt like shedding a skin I didn't know I'd been wearing. But the days that followed, those were the ones that showed me just how deep the rot had gone, how far I'd let myself drift into someone else's life instead of living my own. Up at Grey Rock Ridge, the world didn't care what Tessa said about me. There were no judgmental eyes, no passive-aggressive digs, no performative smiles meant for group chats. Just cold wind, trees, silence. And me. I stayed off the grid for 3 days. No phone. No news. No checking email just to stay on top of things. I chopped wood in the mornings. Hiked in the afternoons. Cooked my meals over the fire pit. Sat on the porch wrapped in a thick flannel blanket. And listened to the coyotes call to each other in the distance like ghosts trading secrets. Funny thing is, she never once asked to go to the cabin while we were together. Said it was too isolating, too rugged. No trendy coffee shops. No brunch spots. No spa appointments. And definitely no service bars on her phone. She used to joke that it felt like the place had been built to keep her out. Maybe it had. I had the kind of sleep up there I hadn't felt in months. Not just physically restful, but the kind where your mind finally stops trying to fix everything. No dreams of us arguing. No imaginary conversations where I said all the things I never did. Just deep, dark, restorative quiet. When I finally turned the phone back on, the signal took its time climbing to 1 bar, then 2, and with it came the flood. 48 more calls. 71 new texts. All from her. There was one email at the top of my inbox, titled in all caps. Please talk to me. I didn't open it. I knew what it would say. Apologies that weren't really apologies. Explanations meant to deflect, not accept. Maybe even threats disguised as desperation. I'd seen it before. Not from her, but in people like her. When they realize the person they underestimated finally got tired, they panic. Not because they're sorry, but because they lost control. That's what those 162 calls had been about. Control. I deleted the messages without opening them. Then I blocked her number. That small, silent action felt like a spiritual exhale. Not rage. Not revenge. Just peace. The next few days were spent refilling what she had quietly drained from me. I started sketching again, not work projects, but freehand. Rough cabin ideas, minimalist decks, workshop plans for a retirement property I had put off for years. I played old jazz records on the portable player. Read a paperback I'd left up there 3 summers ago. Even fixed the leaky valve in the shower I'd been ignoring. Each task reminded me I could still build. Still choose. It wasn't about her anymore. It wasn't even about what she did. It was about reclaiming the pieces of myself I had quietly handed over to someone who never saw the value in them. The world started to come back into focus. On the morning of day 4, I got back into my truck and drove into town. I didn't rush. Stopped at a quiet diner on the way, same booth as before. The waitress asked if I wanted the usual. I didn't correct her, didn't say that usual was something I'd only had twice. I just nodded. There's something comforting in being seen that way, consistent, familiar, even if it's a small corner of the world that thinks so. After breakfast, I called Joel to check in. He answered on the second ring. Hey boss, you good? I'm better than I've been in a long time. Glad to hear it. You want the file for the hospital bid? Send it over tonight. I'll take a look tomorrow. You got it. Oh, and just so you know, someone's been asking around. About you. I already knew who. Tessa. Yeah, she called the office. I didn't say anything personal, just that you were away handling a site project. Thanks. If she calls again, don't engage. Understood. I stopped by the hardware store after that. Picked up a new bolt lock and some fresh paint. Something about resetting the house made me feel like I was finally sealing it off from whatever version of me she tried to overwrite. It wasn't about hiding. It was about reclaiming. By late afternoon, I was back home. The place smelled faintly of lavender from the air freshener she'd insisted on using, but it was fading. I opened all the windows. Let real air back in. Put on one of my old records, Coltrane, soft but steady, and repainted the entryway a darker shade. Something grounded. Something real. Her things had been packed by then. I had Joel send them out through a courier service. Nothing thrown out, nothing broken. Just neatly folded pieces of a life that no longer belonged in my space. I didn't even leave a note. She kept trying to reach me through burner numbers, emails, even Facebook. I blocked each one, calmly. No drama. Just a quiet exit. One day, while sorting mail, I noticed a letter. Handwritten. No return address, but I recognized the curves of her handwriting immediately. My instinct was to tear it, burn it, toss it, but I didn't. I opened it, read it once, then dropped it in the recycling bin without a word. It said everything I expected: how sorry she was, how harmless the call had been, how I knew her humor, how none of it was serious, how I took it too far, and finally, how she still believed we had something worth salvaging. There was not a single line that said, "I hurt you," or even, "I was wrong." That told me everything. Sometimes people aren't sorry for what they did. They're just sorry it cost them access to you. That night, I slept like a stone. No calls. No laughter through the door. No whispered strategies hidden in shared drives. Just me. And quiet. And that was more than enough. Back at work, everything looked the same on the surface. Same office, same tools, same desk with a worn patch on the edge from years of leaning elbows. But something in me had shifted. The kind of shift you don't announce. It doesn't show in your clothes, or your tone, or your schedule. It shows in your presence. I wasn't moving like a man trying to make things work anymore. I wasn't carrying invisible weight. I had laid it down, quietly, and picked up something heavier but truer: myself. I dove into the hospital expansion bid like a man with something to prove, but not to her. To myself. I hadn't taken on a project this large in years. It was a full structural redesign for a regional trauma center up north for new wings, earthquake-resistant support beams, green roof installations, and staff housing. It wasn't just a big contract. It was legacy work. Something that would outlive me. My team noticed the change immediately. Dina, our procurement lead who never missed a thing, gave me a look one morning over our whiteboard session and said, "You're focused like a sniper lately." I smiled and simply said, "Time's valuable." And that was all I needed to say. The thing is, once you remove someone who drains you quietly over time, you don't realize how much clarity comes flooding in until the fog lifts. I have been operating at 70% for a long time, just enough to keep the machine running. But now, there was no more noise. No one second-guessing my instincts. No offhand remarks like, "Are you sure this is still your passion? Or maybe you should start thinking about retirement." Now it was just work. Clean. Purposeful. Meanwhile, the outside noise was building. Not from her directly anymore. I'd shut that door tight, but through the back channels. Tessa had always been the type to keep a circle of curated friendships. Not deep ones. Not the kind you call at 2 a.m. in crisis. Just curated ones, useful people, status-oriented, wine-wrapped approval machines. Apparently, she'd been doing damage control. It started small. Mutual acquaintances casually asked if I was doing okay, usually with an expression that said they weren't sure what story they'd heard, but they'd definitely heard one. I'd respond politely, "Doing better than ever. Thanks for asking." One woman, an old connection from the local Chamber of Commerce, actually asked me, with a half-smile, what happened to the guy who used to write her poems. I looked her straight in the eye and said, "Turns out, I wasn't forgettable after all." She blinked, didn't know what to say, just laughed awkwardly and changed the subject. It felt good. Clean. No shouting. No bitterness. Just a sentence that dropped like a pebble into a still pond and rippled exactly the way I intended. Later that week, I did something I never thought I would. I opened that folder again, the one I had found on her drive. Exit Strategy, Spring 25. I don't know why. Maybe curiosity. Maybe closure. Maybe something deeper. There it was again, every cold, calculated step. The plans she had made while still sleeping in my bed. The housing searches. The financial checklist. The conversation templates for leaving with grace. She had spent more time planning how to discard me than she ever spent understanding me. But I didn't get angry. I printed 3 things from that folder and slipped them into a manila file I labeled Truth in case she forgets. I never showed it to her. Never threatened her with it. That's not who I am. But some truths deserve to be preserved, not for revenge, but as reminders. Evidence that I hadn't imagined the insult. That I wasn't being dramatic. That I didn't just overreact to a silly girl's call. After all, she made spreadsheets about replacing me. I left a note. We were never playing the same game. I told no one about that folder. Not even Joel. But I did show it to Rena, my lawyer. She read through the printed pages without a word. When she finished, she looked up and said, "You did the right thing walking away quietly. But if she ever tries to circle back, you keep this close." "I will," I said. "Any financial entanglements left?" "None," I told her. She was never on the title. No joint accounts. Just some access privileges. Already revoked. She nodded, satisfied. Then let her say what she wants. You're clean. I thanked her and walked out into the early evening light, feeling like a man who had just scrubbed the last smudge off a window. The best part? I never had to raise my voice. I never had to expose her. She was unraveling herself just fine. From what I heard, the Cancun trip didn't end well. Cam, who turned out to be a marketing executive from one of her partner firms, apparently hadn't been as single as he claimed. His wife found out. There were screenshots, a quiet HR complaint, and Tessa was being repositioned within her company. That was the official word. She called again after that, not from her old number. A new one. I didn't answer, but the voicemail came through anyway. I know you're ignoring me. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. You didn't deserve any of it. I was stupid. You were the only real thing I ever had. Delete. That's all I did. One tap. Gone. I didn't need her sorrow. I didn't need her tears. I didn't need anything from her anymore. Not closure, not explanation, not recognition. I had already moved on. Not with someone else. Not yet. But with myself. That was enough. I spent my weekends differently now. I picked up my old camera again, something I hadn't touched since before we met. I started taking photos of roofs, bridges, worn-out steel bolts, and rusted hinges. Beauty and function. Stability is art. I'd forgotten how much I loved capturing things that held their own weight. One Sunday, while walking through a historic neighborhood on the coast, I saw an elderly woman inspecting a cracked beam beneath her front porch. I offered to take a look. Turned out, she was a retired marine architect. Her name was Lucinda Perrin, 81, sharp as a blade and twice as steady. We talked for over an hour about the erosion patterns in coastal homes. I offered to help patch the porch. She declined the help, but invited me to tea the following weekend. Anyone who notices structural weaknesses at first glance is someone I should know, she said. I smiled. I've been noticing cracks for a while now. We both laughed. The honest kind. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was standing in a moment that wasn't borrowed. No one else's expectations. No pretending. Just me. And something real beginning again, quietly. I hadn't meant to fall in love with the coast. At first, it was just an escape route. A quiet shoreline town with salt-stained cottages, worn docks, and locals who minded their own business. But the more time I spent there, the more it began to feel like something I hadn't experienced in years, belonging. Not the kind of belonging you find in someone else's arms or in a perfect dinner party with smiling guests. I'm talking about the kind that wraps itself around your bones without asking, that lets you breathe fully, without performance. I bought a modest craftsman home on a bluff overlooking the water. It wasn't large, but it had everything I needed: a wide porch, clean lines, real wood, and a fireplace that didn't just sit there looking pretty, but actually worked. The first time I stood on that porch as the sun sank behind the horizon and lit the sky in shades of fire and ash, I felt something loosen inside me, like I'd finally exhaled a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. It was around then that Lucinda and I started walking together. Nothing romantic. Just two people with tired hands and quiet minds, sharing space without noise. She was unlike anyone I'd ever met, 81. Yes, but sharper than most people half her age. There was a stillness to her that wasn't silence, it was presence. She didn't need to fill the air with commentary or compliments. She simply noticed things. The way the tide curled just before it turned. The difference between wind-worn cedar and waterlogged pine. She was a woman who had lived enough to stop performing and enough to appreciate people who didn't need applause. We would walk the stretch from my house down to the fishing docks every evening. She told me stories about marine structures she'd designed in the 80s, how she fought to get taken seriously in a room full of men who thought her clipboard was ornamental. I listened more than I spoke. She never asked about Tessa. Not once. And I never offered anything more than what came naturally. Because here's the thing. Peace doesn't need an explanation. One evening, as we walked back toward her cottage, she paused at the gate and turned to me. You know, she said, there's a big difference between letting go and giving up. You didn't give up. You reclaimed. A curated life, a woman with a brand, not a heart. And finally, without even realizing it, I let it all fall behind me like debris in the tide. The house I bought came with a small detached workshop. I turned it into a space for sketches and models, nothing commercial, just for me. I started drawing again. Not blueprints for clients, but small, strange designs I'd once dreamed of building. A suspended reading deck. A hidden garden bench with water-channeling beams. Pieces of me I hadn't touched since I was in my 30s. Pieces that Tessa would have called quaint or unscalable. One afternoon while sanding down a cedar slab, I found a notification blinking on my old tablet. I hadn't signed out of the cloud folder from before. Tessa had uploaded something new. A document. The title read, "Letter to Graham, unsent." I stared at it for a long moment. I could have deleted it. Could have ignored it. But something in me wanted to see what unfinished words looked like when they weren't designed to manipulate. So I opened it. It wasn't long. "I don't know if I'll ever send this. I wouldn't blame you if you never spoke to me again. I said cruel things, but the worst part is I believed them when I said them. Not because they were true, but because I was afraid. Afraid you'd see through me. Afraid you'd stay longer than I could hold you. So I laughed before I could be left. I sabotaged the one place I felt safe. That was me. That was my fear. Not your failure." I closed it. I didn't respond. I didn't even save the file. Because it wasn't mine to carry anymore. That letter wasn't a bridge. It was a raft. Something she threw into the water when the current got too rough. And I wasn't in the water with her anymore. I had my feet on solid ground. That same week, I got word that the hospital bid had been awarded. Our firm had secured the contract, the largest we'd ever taken on. Joel called me as soon as the news came in. "You did it, boss," he said, his voice buzzing with excitement. "We're in." I leaned back in the porch chair, let the sea wind move through my shirt, and simply said, "Good. Let's build something worth remembering." A few days later, I met with the mayor of the coastal town. They'd heard about the hospital project and wanted to discuss a smaller contract, renovating their neglected veteran center. I agreed before he even finished the pitch. It wasn't about money. It was about roots. About finally using my hands and mind for something that fed my soul instead of patching someone else's ego. Lucinda came by that evening with a bottle of red wine. Local, sharp, earthy. We sat on the deck without music, just the hum of crickets and ocean spray. "You seem lighter," she said. "I think I've finally stopped dragging ghosts," I replied. She clinked her glass against mine and said, "Here's to uninvited hauntings going quiet." We drank. Later, as the stars came out and the waves began their steady lull, I realized something I hadn't put into words before. I didn't want my old life back. Not one piece of it. Not the house. Not the dinners. Not the social circles or the travel plans or even the furniture she helped pick out. I didn't want revenge. I wanted something better, a life no one could belittle, dismiss, or rewrite in their group chat. I wanted peace that wasn't dependent on being needed. I wanted joy that didn't ask permission. And I had found it. Not in another person, not in some grand success, but in the decision to stop performing and simply live. A new life, built not from what I lost, but from what I finally remembered. Who I was before I let myself be defined by someone else's fear. It happened on a Thursday evening. The kind where the sky turned gold before it fell into charcoal, and the air carried the scent of salt, driftwood, and the faintest trace of rosemary from a nearby garden. I had just finished dinner at a small coastal bistro, a place with handwritten menus and waitstaff who remembered your name by the second visit. I wasn't in a rush to leave. I sat at the bar sipping ginger tea, listening to the low hum of conversation and cutlery tapping on ceramic. Then I heard it. Graham. I knew the voice before I turned around. Not because I missed it, but because some voices become etched into your bones, even after you've removed the person they belonged to from your life. I turned slowly. Tessa was standing near the entrance, clutching a small handbag like it might keep her from unraveling completely. Her makeup was heavier than I remembered. Her posture was different, shoulders slightly rounded, not sharp like they used to be. She looked smaller somehow. Or maybe I had just grown taller in my own absence. She stepped forward. "Please, can we talk?" Her voice was quieter than it used to be. No trace of that confident sales pitch she wore around her neck like jewelry. I took one last sip of tea and stood up. Not to flee. Just to stretch my legs. The bistro had a small parking lot behind it with picnic lights strung across the fence. I walked toward it, and she followed. Once outside, she stood there like someone waiting for a verdict. "I didn't come here to beg," she said, though her eyes told a different story. "I just thought, maybe we could have a conversation. Like adults." I nodded once. "Go ahead." She exhaled slowly, like the breath had been trapped in her chest since the day I left. It was stupid. What I said. What I did. It wasn't meant to hurt you. It was just wine talk. You know how I get. I was trying to make them laugh. She paused, as if waiting for me to say something. I didn't. "You never said anything," she added, her tone softer now. Not after the call. Not after the note. You just vanished. I looked at her. Really looked at her. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel anything. No sting. No pull. Just distance. Not the kind you travel to close. The kind that reminds you how far you've already gone. You know, I said, my voice even, a mistake is sending a message to the wrong person. Planning an exit strategy in spreadsheets, that's not a mistake. That's who you are. She opened her mouth to speak, but I raised a hand gently. You didn't just insult me. You documented how to leave me. You mocked me in group chats, laughed at my kindness. And then, when I finally left, you tried to convince the world I was overreacting. Her eyes welled, but she blinked quickly, like someone trying to stay on script. I wasn't thinking clearly, she offered. I was scared. Things were changing. I wasn't, I replied. I was steady. I was building something. She took a step forward. I miss you. I didn't realize how much until you lost access, I finished for her. She flinched. I didn't come here to fight, she said again, more to herself this time. I just thought, maybe there was still a window. There was, I said calmly. And it closed the moment I saw you laughing while dismantling my character like a joke. Tears finally broke the edges of her voice. I don't know how to fix this. That's the thing, Tessa, I said, and for the first time, I said her name like it belonged to a stranger. You can't. That's the whole point. She stood still for a long moment, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her bag, her eyes searching my face for some trace of the man who would once have comforted her. But I was no longer him. That man had given her every quiet gift he had, and she turned it into background noise. You've changed, she whispered. I've returned, I corrected. She looked away, then back at me. Can I call you sometime? Just to check in. I gave her the faintest smile. Not cruel. Just final. I don't need checking in on. And you're not the person I trust to do it. A silence fell between us, not uncomfortable, but full, like a book whose last page had finally been read. She stepped back, nodded faintly, and said, Okay, I get it. Then she turned and walked toward her car. I didn't watch her drive away. I simply turned back toward the bistro, stepped inside, and paid my bill. The server asked if everything was all right. I nodded. Better than all right. And I meant it. That night, as I stood on the porch of my home with a blanket over my shoulders and a cup of tea in my hand, I felt no bitterness, no regret, just a strange, beautiful clarity. Closure doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it walks up quietly in a parking lot, wearing makeup over fear, and leaves empty-handed. And when it does, you don't slam the door. You just don't open it again. 6 months later, the hospital project was officially ours. The ink was dry on the contract, and our firm was overseeing the single largest build we'd ever been trusted with. It should have felt like the peak of something, but for me, it felt more like the beginning of a new life entirely. Not the kind I used to dream of in my 20s, with awards and speeches and magazine features. No, this was a quieter kind of fulfillment. The kind that made me wake up before the alarm, pour my coffee in silence, and actually look forward to each day again. I opened a satellite office near the coast. A simple building, built from reclaimed lumber, large windows, and a communal workspace that overlooked the water. Joel moved down temporarily to help set up the systems. Dina joined twice a week for on-site materials coordination. But most of our staff stayed remote, and for the first time in a long time, the company felt alive again. Not just functional, thriving. People weren't just working for paychecks. They were building something that mattered. Something that would serve generations. A trauma wing. A recovery garden. Staff housing for traveling nurses. It wasn't just steel and beams. It was hope in the form of structure. I started hosting monthly lunches for veterans in the trade, carpenters, welders, roofers, engineers who'd been pushed out of the market by younger, faster talent or technology they couldn't catch up with. Some of them hadn't picked up a blueprint in years. Others were looking for work, but too proud to ask. I made sure there was always room at the table and a pot of coffee on. No press. No posts. Just respect. One of the veterans I met was named Raymond, 68, with calloused hands and a back that curved slightly from 3 decades of bending over steel frames. Over sandwiches one afternoon, he looked at me and said, "You build quiet. I can see it in how your people move. You don't yell. You just lead." I nodded, humbled. That was the best compliment I'd heard in years. As for Lucinda, she kept walking with me, now not just at sunset, but sometimes in the mornings too. She never pried about Tessa. Never asked why I looked tired some days or why I stared out at the sea a little longer than usual. She just walked. And occasionally, she'd say something so precise it felt like a page from my own thoughts. "You've stopped apologizing for the space you take up," she noted once as we reached the pier. "That's why your shoulders don't look so heavy anymore." I smiled. "I think I just stopped asking for permission." She chuckled. "You never needed it in the first place." There was a rhythm now, a cadence to life that didn't rush or stall. My days were filled with site visits, design consultations, quiet conversations with young apprentices from the local trade school. Two of them, Benji and Arturo, had never used hand tools before. They'd grown up around screens, not steel. But they had the hunger. And I gave them what I once wished someone had given me: time, patience, purpose. Benji reminded me of myself at 25, observant, cautious, eager to please, but terrified of being seen as weak. One day, while we were checking alignment on an elevated deck frame, he said, "Sir, I hope you don't mind me asking, but how do you know when someone doesn't see you?" I paused, looked out over the line of trees where the wind was just beginning to turn toward autumn. "You know," I said slowly, "when their idea of you is louder than your presence. When they speak for you without ever asking how you feel." He nodded, chewing on the words like they were new lumber, rough, but useful. That's when I realized the things I had endured, the quiet heartbreak, the humiliation, the disappointment, it hadn't been wasted. It had become instruction. Tessa still tried to call now and then. She found ways around blocks, emails from different addresses, the occasional message through a mutual friend. But I never opened them. I had built something stronger than a wall. A life. One afternoon, while sorting through receipts in my coastal office, I saw her name flash across the screen again. Not a call this time, an old ringtone, a distant echo from a different version of me. It made me pause. Not out of sadness. Not anger. Just curiosity. I realized I didn't remember what her voice sounded like when she wasn't performing. I set the phone down. Let it ring. The screen dimmed. Silence returned. That's how healing sounds, quiet where there was once noise. I thought about that night in the bistro parking lot often, not because it haunted me, but because it reminded me of something essential. Closure doesn't come when someone says sorry. It comes when you realize you no longer need them to. Lucinda had told me once, we spend too much time waiting for the apology that fits the wound. But the truth is, wounds close whether the apology comes or not. The scar just reminds you to walk a little wiser. I looked around my home that night and saw no trace of Tessa. No throw pillows she insisted were designer. No wine glasses chosen to impress. No scented candles or art that didn't mean anything. Just clean wood, open air, and peace. The apprentices had painted a small piece of driftwood as a gift and left it on my desk. It read, "Steady hands, clear eyes, no noise." I smiled when I saw it. Because they got it. They really got it. It sits in a frame on the shelf above my drafting table. Just a scrap of printer paper, edges curled slightly from age, the ink a little faded. 7 simple words written in my own hand. You're easy to forget too. Some might call it petty. Others might say it was just a note. But to me, it's neither. It's a marker. Not of revenge. Not of pain. But of clarity. It's the line between who I was and who I chose to become. When I first wrote it, I didn't think it would end up in a frame. I didn't imagine I'd keep it at all. It was instinct, a quiet reaction to the kind of humiliation that could have broken a different man. But the more time passed, the more I realized that note wasn't a jab, it was a turning point. A declaration, not for her, but for myself. A reminder that letting go doesn't mean losing. Sometimes it's the beginning of everything. The morning I framed it, the sun had just broken across the water. Light spilled into the room like something new, and I stood there holding the note, realizing it didn't hurt anymore. The memory didn't sting. The words didn't echo. They just existed. And that's when I knew I had finally crossed the threshold. The part where peace isn't something you chase. It's just there, living beside you like an old friend who never asks for much. These days, I don't tell the story often. Not because I'm ashamed of it, but because it doesn't define me. Tessa is a chapter. A loud one, yes, but a chapter all the same. And the man who came out the other side of that chapter? He's someone I trust a lot more than the man who walked into it. Life now is slower, but richer. The hospital build is nearly halfway done. Our foundation is poured, the skeleton rising higher each week, and I make it a point to visit the site every few days, not to supervise, but to witness. To stand there, hard hat in hand, and know that something lasting is taking shape. Benji and Arturo, my 2 apprentices, have grown into themselves beautifully. Benji's working on roof systems now, managing a team with quiet authority I hadn't seen in him just a few months ago. Arturo's found a knack for interior framing, surprising all of us with his precision. They bring their lunches out to the deck behind the site trailer sometimes, and we just sit. No long speeches. Just men eating sandwiches and letting the world spin quietly. Lucinda still walks with me. Rain or shine. She's slower now, her knees stiffening with the seasons, but her mind is as sharp as ever. We talk about everything and nothing. She's become something like family, though we never labeled it. One night, as we sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching the stars blink awake, she said something I'll never forget. You didn't just survive, Graham. You evolved. That's rarer than people think. And I believed her. Because I had. Tessa still pops up from time to time. Not physically, not in any confrontational way, but through the occasional echo. A name dropped at a business meeting. An old email thread that resurfaces. Once, Joel mentioned she had started a consulting firm, leaning on her old biotech connections. I nodded and let the information slide off me like water on sealed wood. It didn't stick, because she doesn't stick anymore. She became what she once accused me of being, forgettable. And that's not cruelty. That's consequence. The truth is, she never really saw me. She saw a version of me that fit her needs at the time. Quiet, stable, successful enough to impress her friends, but quiet enough to fade into the background. And maybe that's the part that stings most for people like her. When the man you assumed would always stay in your shadow steps out into the sun and doesn't look back. I've built something here that no one can touch. Not out of spite, but out of purpose. This coastal life. This simple, structured, steady rhythm is mine. It's not built on someone else's dreams. It's not shaped by compromise or curated for optics. It's honest. Every beam, every wall, every line on every page comes from me. And there's something deeply healing in that. Sometimes I get letters now, handwritten ones, from men who've heard fragments of my story. Colleagues, former clients, even strangers. They don't ask for advice. They just share. Tales of betrayal, of quiet heartbreak, of the silent kind of loneliness that settles in when the world thinks you're fine because you don't scream. I write back when I can. I don't give them answers. Just reflections. Because that's all anyone really needs sometimes. Not a fix. Just proof that someone else came through the fire intact. One of the letters said, "How do you forgive someone who humiliated you like you were disposable?" And my answer, simple and direct, was, you don't forgive them to let them back in. You forgive them so they stay out without dragging pieces of you with them. That's what the note on my shelf reminds me of. That forgetting someone isn't erasing them. It's releasing yourself. A few weeks ago, Lucinda brought me a gift. A small carving of driftwood, smooth and warm in the hand, shaped like a house with no door. I raised an eyebrow. It's a reminder, she said. You don't owe entry to anyone anymore. I laughed. That might be the most poetic boundary I've ever seen. She smiled. You've earned the right to build walls that don't open unless you choose. And I have. Because that's what this whole journey has been about, really. Not closure. Not even healing. Ownership. Of my time. My heart. My space. My future. I didn't slam a door. I didn't burn a bridge. I simply build a home no one gets to enter unless they know how to hold it with care. And that's not bitterness. That's wisdom. So when people ask me now if I ever think about her, if I ever wonder what could have been, I tell them the truth. I don't. Because what could have been doesn't matter when what is finally enough. And every time I look at TH,